All right. Hey folks, hope you're doing well today. So today we've got Lee with us. Lee is a really good friend of mine. He is an Unreal developer who's been working on a really cool game called Soar. It is a VR game where you just basically fly around. I've tried it. It's a ton of fun. And he's currently working on a bunch of other projects. One of them is unreleased, if I'm not mistaken, and unannounced. So I don't know what he's working on at the moment. But he is here to tell us a bit about how he works, how he's used Unreal Engine before to like make stuff, a bit about his journey, a bit about marketing, a bit about design, a bit about the technical side of stuff, and
Bit
basically it's
about
going
a
to be a bit
bit.
of. Hmm?
No, go ahead.
And it's basically going to be like a little post-mortem as well of his project. So Lee, thank you so much for being here. And if you'd
Thank
like to
you.
introduce yourself some more and just tell us about what you do, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay, sounds good. Hello everyone. Hello Sada. I hope you guys have a informative time in during the session. It's gonna be oh shit, I forgot to screen share. Okay, what about now? Is it good now?
Yep, we can see your
Yes.
screen.
Okay, amazing. Okay, so the title of the talk is gonna be a developing your first VR game as if reality wasn't painful enough. It's a little bit more fun in virtual reality, but maybe with a lot more headaches and a lot more nausea just because of the nature of VR. But that's fine because we're gonna be talking about it and we're gonna see what will work out or not. So my goal for this session is that you leave the talk in a way where you feel a little bit more informed, a little bit more knowledgeable about the VR market, about the VR environment, about the VR development ecosystem, about the whole ecosystem in general, actually, not just development, just so you can get a sense of where to start, where to get going, different things we're going to talking about, like lessons and whatnot, and different techniques. We're going to go a little bit, dive a little bit with an inside Unreal for a little bit, and then out. So there's going to be a bit of everything. Okay, so I hope you get. I hope you are. Yeah, that's it. So a little bit about myself before I continue talking, in case what I talk about sounds a little bit bullshit. It kind of is, but a little bit of credibility for myself. I've been working in games for the last 10 years. I've worked with a bunch of many different games inside Unreal in ever since Unreal 4.7. I've worked on recently called Soar. It's out on MetaQuest. It's got bunch of good reviews, got a bunch of good people playing it. It's pretty nice. We're very happy. We're very proud with the stuff that we've been doing there. Um, Worked on a game called Cyversity. We're currently a network engineer at Plastic Battlegrounds. It's another VR game at the moment right now as well, and worked on a bunch of game jams as well. And I was part of the Dutch Game Garden as well. It's like a very fun. Unfortunately, it's been closed down, but it was like a very nice, super fun, super informative business side of game dev as well. And then here is me holding inside on the Unreal Engine channel, and here is me, young me as well, holding an award back when I was filled with hopes and dreams, and I was young until we took a very weird alternative timeline after 2019, 2020. But oh well. Anyway, so the first thing I want to talk about, which I think is probably one of the most important things I want to talk about, because I do want to really sort of reshape how you look at the VR market. Because really, for the last 10 years, it's been less actually. Like the VR market has been less of that, like the robustness of it, right? It has been around for that long, and really for the last 10 years, um, we haven't developed a lot further from 10 years ago, which is a lot of it is a good news, and a lot of it is okay news. You can do whatever with that. But the average person who knows about VR would know, like, okay, what's like the top game in VR? Well, Beat Saber, maybe. I mean, it is right now, but that's not the case anymore. It's not just Beat Saber anymore. It's been a lot more developed, a lot more matured, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the state. So like I said, it's been 10 years since really the market has been shaping up in the VR commercially. And until the last 5 years, you actually saw a lot of sales being driven through the hardware of the Meta Quest, primarily. Now, there's different hardwares, such as Pico, such as Sony PSVR. Of course, there's Valve and whatnot. But primarily, you're looking at Meta XR, sorry, not XR, Meta Platform, or the Meta Quest, that derives most of the numbers and most of the revenue. So where's the state of that at the moment? So we're talking about this is comparison. So when I'm saying less and whatnot, I'm comparing it with the flat screen console gaming, right? Um, so one of the most important things that it is way less populated and it has a way lower standard. When I say way less populated, is that removing from the fact that there is something called side quests and you can have like bunch of different demos and whatnot, the actual store itself is far less populated than obviously the Play Store or Steam or even Xbox's Microsoft Store, right? So you are dealing with basically more exposure in that sense because you have less games on the market. Now, there is a stat somewhere that I forgot the accuracy of it, but Steam has like 100 games released per day or per week at this point, right? So it is brutal out there, right? And an important point that I need to mention is that, and this is not to demotivate you, obviously, of course, and um, but right now the VR, not the VR market, the market in general, the game industry in general, is going through a very difficult time. It's going through a very big turmoil for the last 2 or 3 years. You know, there's been more than 10,000 layoffs across the industry. There's been a lot of shifts in how we review how we am I looking that okay. Uh, there's been shifts on how we view development, how we view game development as a profitable medium, as a artistic and as a creative medium. That's been changing a lot just because of just how things have been changing in the last 3 years. Now, that is equally bleeding obviously in the VR market. Um, but at the same time, there is there is more hope of life or more hope of like pulling it off in the VR market. And I'll talk further more about it. So when I say lowest standard, so in the slideshow I'm saying lowest standard. So when I say lowest standard, the standard is actually a lot lower. So when you look at the top 10, 20 games, and at the end of the small thing, I will show you like the top 20 to 30 currently bestseller games. And we want to like draw some comparisons and so cross some references. But when you look at the top 10, 20 games, your standard is actually not that high. The amount of standard that you're looking at right now at Steam, you have to pull off an obnoxiously amount um, of polish in your game. What worked 10 years ago in terms of the standard doesn't work anymore, right? Whereas the VR market is like, oh, 10 years ago it didn't exist. So where's the standard now? Well, the standard now, if I were to give it an analogy, the standard right now is somewhere between the PlayStation 2 era and the PlayStation 3 era. And speaking of that, this is where the hardware limitations come in. The hardware limitations come in because our current devices, so this is the Meta XR for the Meta Quest 3, for example, this has the power of a GPU from 2018, from 2019, right? And we'll talk more about performance limitations later. But you're dealing with basically a phone, a portable phone, because it's not cable, it's standalone, right? You're dealing with a portable phone with the power of a GPU from 2018, but you have to render basically twice. We'll talk more about specifics. What do you mean by that later? But because you're doing that, you are also having to deal with lower quality, lower polish, lower whatnot. But the beautiful thing about this, though, and I guess I didn't mention this in the slideshow, but a beautiful thing about this is that you're using tools made in 2025 and not in 2005 and 2006 and 7 and 8, but you're basically targeting a standard of the equivalent of what it is right now between that era, between the 2010s, between mid 2000s and late 2000s, right? So this is a bit of a caveat there, and we'll talk more about it later. Now, another thing as well, AAA titles are not that much in VR. There's a couple of reasons why, right? I do want to mention that I forgot to mention this disclaimer, but I do want to mention that a lot of these are my own observations. A lot of these are things that I've came up in terms of observing and working in the market for the last 4 years. And I've been sharing them with them. Of course, do your own research and verify the case, but this is my current observations. And one of the observations that I've looked at the last couple of years is that there's not a lot of AAA titles. You know, when we talk about AAA titles in the VR market, we have a couple of things that we're thinking about. Half-Life, Alex, from what, 2019 at this point, right? Assassin's Creed, which came out 2 years ago and it didn't do well. I mean, it's a great game, but it just didn't do well financially as a company for the company, right? And Metro and a bunch of others, right? So the reason for that, there's a couple of reasons why. first of all, the main reason is that they're realizing, oh, if I spend like $50 million on a VR on a VR game, but then get in return 2 million or 3 million, 5 million, what's the point? Like, why am I doing that? And we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well, because that's actually the risks of the VR market, simply because of the audience. But that's the reality: is that they're realizing, oh, we actually, like, it's worthless to spend that much money. You have mostly, companies just care about their profits and their revenue, especially the AAA ones, right? At the end of the day. So that's unfortunately the case. So another state is that the teams are a lot smaller. So when I talk with a lot of developers out there, the thing that I mentioned that I notice a lot with VR teams is that really they're relatively small, right? We're talking about between 1 to 20, a lot more on average than the one you find on flat screen and consoles. And there's a good reason for that, even for big titles as well, right? Um, Again, this is tied to the burn rate. This is tied to how much money I'm spending to make this game versus how much profit I'm getting back, right? And then one thing as well is that the audience is quite young. So you'll hear a lot of stories about people coming inside VR and hearing kids screaming and shouting and swearing at each other. And that's kind of the case, really. Like, a lot of VR audience is mostly made up of young people, very similarly to how things were back when the first commercial generation consoles came out, the Nintendos and the NES, arguably PlayStation 1s and whatnot. We were all kids at some point or another, right? And so this is what's basically happening again in the VR market, because of a different hardware. And one thing as a consequence will happen is that just like we grew up, they're going to grow up as well, and that will change the market a little bit in the future. So keep that in mind, because that's actually what's been talked about right now. Games, the way are designed right now, are being shifted a little bit to accommodate people getting older, because 5 years ago, there was a lot more concentration of younger people, but it's still quite young compared to the flat screen, right? And then the most important point I do want to mention is not many publishers. The reason why I want to say that is because I do want to shape up how you look at funding. And like we said earlier in the talk, this is going to be a mix of a lot of different things about the VR, about talking about VR, technical engineering, design, whatnot, right? So one of them is going to be handling and doing and managing your funding and whatnot. And so the problem right now is that because you don't have a lot of publishers, you also have a less chance of success to get funded as a VR studio. There's a lot of reasons why publishers don't exist in the VR market, or they're a lot more like tied up. Their hands are more tied up in the VR market. They do see the reality of it in terms of like, oh, why are we spending this much money and then only getting this return? So again, like I said earlier, this is a caveat of like there's a pros and cons that that equation. But keep that in mind, because the chances of being funded is a little bit more difficult. One thing for sure in the last couple of years while I was working in the VR market is that the Meta themselves are one of the primary sources of actually getting funds from to continue your development of the game. Obviously, there's a lot of different smaller funds like Epic Mega Grant and, like I said, publishers, but primarily you're looking at Meta as one of the key items or key parties to like chase for some funding, because they want that. They want their games to be good on the store. They want to drive consumers and whatnot. So let's talk about opportunities over here. So one thing you do notice that there is a market gap, right? There's a lot of market gaps, and you'll see a ton of games doing something very, very funny and very typical, which is like, they bring in like literally a concept that was made on flat screen or in console, turn into VR, and it does well, right? So there is that sort of like what do you call it, like a dynamic happening where you have market gaps, you have space, you have a lot of space to iterate, you have a lot of space to create novelty, you have a lot of space to just create new experiences within the market, because a lot of that is still being developed. So that's the beautiful thing about the current market right now, is that nothing has been truly established. We're starting to establish standards for sure, right? Like especially in the last 2 years. But when I first got into VR, for example, a lot of it was still very much still developed. Like, okay, what is a standard locomotion system? What is a standard UI interaction? What is a standard? All of that, there's still no standard, by the way. But you're basically talking about like a lot of room for novelty. Okay. Now, because when I said there's a lower standard, it is easier to execute, right? So if you are more than capable to pull off a technically very simple low poly game with very simple shaders, that is very much accepted and achievable in VR, and is not looked at as a negative thing. Hell, asset packs are not looked at as a negative thing in VR either, right? So keep that in mind. And it's actually like it is easier to execute. But if you're just starting out, there's a double-edged sword, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. And another thing, as well as forgivable release windows. Remember when I said that there's not a lot of AAA title games? Well, one of the things that you do as an indie developer, and one of the things that I've learned across the last 10 years, is that you have to also kind of be careful with the release windows. Obviously, like who are you compared to a GTA 6 or whatever, right? But this is all noise against a one primary thing that you're concerned about when you release your game, which is the algorithm on the store, which is how you show up on the store, right? So even though you're not really competing with GTA 6 or competing with the next big title game, you're competing in a space, at a spot on the algorithm on the store. So, and that applies as well on the Meta Quest store. But because you have less population, you have less AAA title games, you also have forgivable release windows. You have also higher chance of being spotlighted and whatnot. We'll talk more about the algorithms as well later when we talk about meta platform. And finally, as a consequences, more exposure, less population, more exposure, right? So I do want to say though, one thing is that the risks are still quite high, right? From a technical point of view and from a studio management point of view, right? First of all, from a technical point of view, you are dealing with a more difficult environment. You are dealing with a far more painful environment. Like me, we'll talk. Me putting a headset on and having to test the game and then package it on Android and then having to test it again and see how that works. That window of me testing things out just because it's on the headset is a lot longer than flat screen games where you can just like test things pretty easily, like in 5 minutes. And hell, if you want to test it on Nate or you want to test it when it's compiled, which probably you don't want, not you don't want to, but you don't have to because you're dealing with the same libraries, you're dealing with the same binaries because it's Windows to Windows, right? Whereas here it's Windows to Android because the MetaQuest is Android, by the way. So you are dealing with a lot more, and you have to do the more difficult the development environment, and that means you also have to have a lot of patience, and you have to have a lot of I have to go push through this. I have to painfully wear my headset, um, painfully endure the headache that I get from using VR, right? So that's from a development point of view, but then there is also like a company slash biz dev slash studio directing slash kind of thing. As we talked about, because there's younger audience, because there's less AAA, not because, but it's a consequence, but because there's a younger audience, because there's less audience in general anyway, there's less hardware availability. So at the end of the day, like how many quests are there compared to flat screen or obviously computers, right, to consoles, right? You do have just basically, statistically, just have such a lower amount of potential revenue in return, simply because there's not a lot of people buying the game compared to Steam and consoles. Now, obviously, there's still a lot of people buying the game, but compared to, and that's where you have to start thinking about the equation a little bit, because you have to start thinking about the burn rate. And that's the economy. When I say the economy, that's the economy of the VR studios and VR market. And we have had to experience that in firsthand, is that you really have to be careful with the burn rate. You really have to be careful with the size of the team as well, compared to the expected money that you might get in return, right? And simply because you have potential less revenue because of it and that, right? I was going to mention one thing, but I am forgetting about it. I also just saw a question. Why is the most interested people? That's actually a very good question. So the question was, why the most interested people are young? So that's actually a very good question. So there's a lot of reasons for that, and I would love to expand on that further. But basically later. But basically, the baseline right now is that such that the hardware is new, and the locomotion is new, the controllers are new, and the medium is new itself. Just like iPads and just like a bunch of other techs out there that came out new, younger people were able to adapt faster and more, and we're able to be more durable to this medium versus older people, right? And that's why when I talk a little bit later about like the tolerance is increasing, that's because the younger people are just getting older, and because they adapted the VR headset at such a younger age that they didn't have any problems with it versus older people where it's like, oh, this is new to me. Like this is like, oh, I'm getting a headache, I'm getting motion sickness, right? um because of that adaptability, there has been found that there has been that kind of success being found with the younger audience, right? And it's um, such a weird dynamic that I've always liked thinking about when it comes to that. Now, one thing for sure as well, when you're talking about development of VR, is that you need to get used to the VR semantics if you're starting out. Now, VR semantics are weird because even if you're experienced, even if you're not, if this is the first time you're doing a VR game development, you're going to have to do it anywhere. You're going to have to go through it. And where are they exactly? So they are a couple of pillars. But before I do that, let me just show you a couple of like quick stats, right? Just to not sound like I'm completely bullshitting. So you've got around 80 million headsets to be released or to be bought, estimated by 2025. Sorry, 2028. Right now, there's about 50 million, which is pretty accurate. Like that's actually the last figure that I've heard from talking to industry people. And like, yeah, then they're like, what? You have 50 million headsets out there. So what? Let's say 5 million are active, right? Where is that sort of? How much can you retain revenue back from that? So it is still a very new market. It is prematuring, but it's also very much a feasible market to enter if you are if you are smart about how you manage your burn rate, how you manage your team, and how you manage your scope as well, which is something super important I will mention later. But also at the same time, another bit of news over here is that Meta has lost a lot of money just by developing all of that. So there is risks at the same time. Now, we'll see what happens in the future. There's a big question mark on the entire industry, let alone on the VR market. But in order to get more data, in order to get actually concrete data, I recommend going to this website called Korean.games /XR dash report. And obviously, it's a paid report because you have to. It is very well in depth into the VR market, but it is made by an individual called Kasek Run, who has helped us out as a studio, who has been very useful to the just bringing this data together. So if you are very much interested into pursuing something very serious commercially, I highly recommend by investing in this report and just looking at the data and see where things are at. So back to semantics. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind with semantics of VR, I don't know if semantics is the right word. I just read it recently off of a book and I'm like, I'm going to use it more. Anyway, so if it's not the right word for this, whatever. But like the terminology, the key pillars of design that you have to keep in mind and design is motion sickness, right? The most important one is motion sickness. Why? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. But why does motion sickness usually happen in VR? The reasoning is actually quite in depth, but the brain-rotted brain of mine has a simple explanation for it, and I like to use it a lot, which is basically this. When you're inside a VR headset, you are seeing and you're hearing different things from what your body is experiencing. So your inner ear isn't actually feeling the forces and the sensations and the whatever that your external senses are seeing. So if you're flying, for example, right? If you're flying normally, you will feel the wind. You will feel the G-forces exerted on your body, on your center of gravity, right? But in VR, in our game, for example, you're flying, you're watching yourself flying, right? But you're not feeling that G-force exertion. You're not feeling that wind. You're not feeling that sort of actual sensation of flying. So what happens there is that your brain starts panicking. It literally starts panicking and thinking, what's happening over here, right? And then that's where the headaches starts to happen, the nausea started to happen, the motion sickness started to happen. So that's where like there's been a lot of effort into mitigating that, and there's a lot of different resources for that. But usually, the way we think about this is that with the do's and don'ts is that first of all, with the do's is that you just need to make sure everything feel more autonomous. And maybe I'm jumping points over here, but One thing I do want to mention is that there has been an increase in tolerance for motion sickness over the last few years. So there has been less of that of an issue, but it has knocked people out and has knocked me out sometimes as well. Not when I'm playing the game in its own way, but when I'm developing, for example, it has knocked me out, and not literally knocked me out, but has made me feel like I can't work anymore because I'm feeling a massive headache, right? And it can make you and break your game. Like at the end of the day, the algorithm of the store, at least one of the things that we noticed in the postmodern is the algorithm of the store works in a way where the session average time and how many times do players go back and play your game. There is so basically the returnability or the replayability. I forgot the actual term for this, but the metric of a person going back to your playing your game or spending an X amount of time per session on it, that motion sickness a bit can really make it or break it. And if you have any little bit of that, you can like no matter how good your game is, you can really destroy your chances of having the algorithm supporting you stay on top of the store page, right? Um, so yeah, one of the things that we do to mitigate motion sickness is autonomy. And when I say autonomy, is like full player autonomy, right? So at the end of the day, when the player puts on a VR headset, what they're doing is that they're basically giving trust to the developer that trust of the developer over their state, right? Because at the end of the day, you are working headset, so unless you pull off the VR headsets very quickly and like you throw it away, the player is in your hands one way or another, right? So the most important thing about when you're designing a VR game is the player's well-being. You have to be very careful with the player's well-being. You have to be careful with the nausea. You have to be careful with the exhaustion. You have to because people will get tired of VR. It's not just like sitting on a couch and like playing on a controller, right? It's a lot more elaborative on that, right? So one thing that you have to do is full autonomy. And what I mean by full autonomy is that you never actually move the player without either alerting them or without their command, right? So, and no sudden movement, no sudden screen shakes, no sudden like unintentional movements. Like you can't just teleport the player from one place to another, right? Unless they literally use a command or an input or an in-game interaction where like, okay, teleport to here, right? But even then, we don't actually like that much. Snapping from one location to another has actually shown to be a little bit of a icky design when it comes to changing the player's position, right? Um, and then one more, and I'll be doing something with Soul right now to show you what I mean by that. But one more thing as well in diegeticness is so non-diegetic and diegetic interactions, right? Primarily in UI. So another design pillar as well in VR is that you have to keep in mind that one of the things that will make and break your game in VR is almost basically how you handle the VR interactions. Genuinely, when we talk about standard a little bit ago, we know that there's a standard in player UI screen in or UX experience in flat screen games. There is a general understanding of like, okay, this means that, this means this button does that, right? Because VR doesn't have that established, you have to also immerse yourself within the actual diegetic VR interactions that exist. No longer you can fill you can like fill your health bar with a button, but instead you have to actually create the interaction itself of like, oh, is this a potion for health? I'm gonna grab it and I'm gonna put it on my face or whatever, right? Or to simulate me eating the potion, right? But you have to really embrace those VR interactions because they are what separates it from flat screen games, and that's what a lot of people like go back to as well and think, okay, well, I really like the interactions in this game. Underdogs is one of the best examples of that, for example. The earliest VR games that came out on the Meta Quest, they had this sort of weirdness of it's basically a flat screen game, but you're just using a thumbstick to move around, right? And that didn't pull off as much. And we're gonna be talking. No, we're not. We're actually gonna jump straight into this aspect, right? So one thing for sure, as time is going on, is that VR is becoming a lot more embracing its interactions, but more primarily the player's locomotion. Like the player's locomotion is such an important thing that it is such a standard in the flat screen games of like, oh, okay, well, if I get a controller and I have a thumbstick and I move around, let's move left and right, right? Previously, 30 years ago, it was thumbsticks, not thumbstick. It was the arrows on the PlayStation 1 controller, or it was like the A and B buttons for whatever, right? So there's a standard now, but back then there wasn't. And that's basically what's happening right now in VR. And if you notice, the top 10 games, they all have their own locomotion system. So what I mean by locomotion system, I mean by the movement system, right? So if I go to the top 10 games, right? And this is going to be a small exercise that I was going to do earlier, but we're going to do it anyway. So if you look at, let's say, the first top 20, 30, 40 games, right? One thing you'll notice for sure is that first of all, it's a mix of old, very popular VR games, such as Beat Saber. Second, they're shooters, right? And third, there is that very fancy or that unique locomotion. So the most important or the most famous example is Gorilla Tag, right? It's no longer Beat Saber that's the king of the VR game. There's actually a game called Gorilla Tag. And by the way, it is literally PlayStation 1, 2, I hope the audio isn't, yeah. It is basically PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 type of graphics, obviously intentionally because of hardware limitations. But the locomotion is genius. The locomotion is basically you're a gorilla and you're basically not hovering. I would say like you literally aiming to touch the floor in game to actually move around like that. And you will feel like you are literally a gorilla that is navigating through a forest and whatnot, right? And that game, back when it came out, and I think it was around 2021, 2020, 2020, that exploded that locomotion focus of like, wait, hold on. VR isn't just about me holding a gun and shooting, or isn't just about me sitting and just like waiting for music notes so I can slice them with my sabers. It became a lot more elaborate than that. And that is showing in the top 20 games at the moment. If you look at Animal Company, Animal Company, Scary Baboon, obviously Gorilla Tag, Yeeps, I Am Cat. So basically the top 10 games, Crowbar Climber, Job Simulator, Funky Monkey, whatever that's called, that's a new one. I'm going to look at that. But basically the top 20 games, you're basically looking at 15, 14 of them have their own locomotion system. And in SOAR, we do have our own locomotion system, which I'll be talking about as well. And then you've got, a bunch of shooters at the bottom. Then you've got Underdogs, another nice whatever. And this is Plastic Backgrounds. This is a game. I'm doing networking engineering for that game. So buy that game very soon, and you'll make us very happy. Anyway, so back to the slide. So that's why locomotion is such an important feature in currently VR market and in how you design your game. And SOAR, when we first started SOAR was basically a flying game, right? SOAR started as an idea of like, there's no flying games in VR. And there's a good reason for that. Honestly, there is a very good reason for that. First of all, what do you mean flying in VR? Do you want to vomit? Do you want to have a massive headache? And that was the case, really. Like, there's been a lot of flying games that's been like that. And honestly, the first year, basically the first year of SOAR was basically that, right? But what we did is that we spent a lot of time just really fine-tuning and really iterating upon the main pillars of autonomy, diegeticness, immersiveness, proper scaling, a lot of design pillars to just facilitate the flying in the game. And I do want to show it to you like right away in the editor. So like maybe it will be useful. But I have compile errors, so it'll take a little bit of time before I can do that. See, this is straight from the development as we speak. And maybe it's not a good idea because there's an NDA contract. So let's just pretend no one's seeing this up until I show you the actual game. See? Okay. Anyway, so one of the things in the game's flying is that our main flying type was that instead of us thinking about flying as controllers, as buttons, we're starting to think about flying as an immersive, diegetic interaction with the world. So in the way you fly in VR, one of the key design pillars that we did is that When you start flying, you actually have to put your arms out, like basically very straightforward. Oh, it paused. Why did it pause? Why did it crash? Okay, well, whatever that may be, the problem. Can you guys still hear me? Because my entire screen is actually frozen. Everything is frozen.
اوكي ماما اذا كان بدك تعملي حلقة شو بتعملي ماما؟ على فكرة شكلها راحت الطحينة اللي كان بدي اياها. اه نمرق عمالك ضروري. نسيت موضوع انا ما نسيتها لانه كانت كثير كيوت.
Fine, can you? My computer crashed. Give them a second, then I'll be right back.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, amazing. So, lesson learned, not play Unreal Editor while I'm screen sharing, while I'm on a call, while I have 100 Google Chrome tabs open at the same time. That will break. That will basically destroy your PC. Anywho, so as you can tell from the flying, basically we just made it in a way where you literally use your circumference of your radius of the player in order to actually direct where you're going, where you're flying. So basically like Superman, right? And but also there's a bunch of other mechanics on top of each other to actually use just purely your hands and not the buttons, right? Your hands in order to direct the flying and soar. As a matter of fact, we actually implemented hand tracking like 4 months ago as well, and you can actually play the entire game with your real hand tracking hands, and that's how we wanted. That's how much we wanted to just separate ourselves away from just like having to deal with buttons. Obviously, buttons came in when we started introducing shooting because the game is about also PvP. It's a multiplayer PvP shooting game, and PvE as well and whatnot. So, but the main locomotion was very much immersing you in what you're saying. And I'm running out of time, but one thing that you have to be careful with autonomy is that since you need to give the player the full sense of autonomy, you need to be careful with basically when they, you know, when you give. This is basically a game called Rich's Plank Experience. You're walking on a plank, and the moment you fall off the plank, you actually fall in the game. But the brain just doesn't associate that. So yeah, broken monitor moment, literally exactly, right? So basically you just have to be careful with autonomy. You have to be careful with how you dictate the movement. At the end of the day, like the one thing that I learned from when I moved from flat screen to VR is that the game is no longer the player is no longer playing your game. The player is literally in the game. Like as much as obnoxious as it sounds, but they are the game. They are literally in the game, and that literally changes a lot of how you interact with the designs and a lot of how you interact with a lot of different things inside the game. Interact as in like designing futures and whatnot, and that it is more uh, it is more painful to design because it's just a lot more attention to details in that sense. Okay, so moving on to engineering. One thing that I would like to share as well is that one thing that I did for SOAR, one of the things that I did for networking what I was doing there in netcode is that so there's a traditional thing that you do in flat screen games, especially in PvP games, first person shooters as well, is that you do something called server correction or server side reconciliation. And it basically happens when you're in your local machine, you're in a position, but the server sees you in a different position than you are, right? And so the server basically says, oh, wait, you shouldn't be there. You should be here. So I'm going to bring you here. I'm going to snap you from there, and I'm going to put you here, right? This is completely unacceptable in VR, right? And one of the things that we need to do in netcode, one of the things that I did it for netcode was that basically avoid that correction and then introduce other subtle ways of bringing network synchronization, right? Because this is a problem of network synchronization. Just the server position is different from the client position, is different from another client position, right? So this is how these pillars, these important constraints will affect a lot of your decisions, a lot of your technical decisions, and a lot of your design decisions. But as I just told you, like one of the technical decisions was made that way. So what I was going to say, performance consideration. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind for when you're working for an engineering or like basically doing engineering for VR is that the good thing is that you are dealing with basically almost a handful of headsets. And what I'm talking about, I'm talking basically like one or two headsets. Like, yes, there's, like I said, there's a bunch of other headsets, but primarily you're targeting one or two headsets mainly. And that's a good thing because you can basically design and optimize and technically work your game towards that platform and not worry about a massive spectrum of different computer machines and different specifications and different GPUs and different CPUs and different RAM size and whatnot. So you're basically dealing with basically a console. So you have literally a mixture of development of console, but it's also a phone. It's not really a console, it's a phone. But phones, you don't have like 50 different phones. You have just one phone, right? And that is a good thing because you can focus on just optimizing it for this current platform. And one of the things that I have to focus upon, or not one of the things, the main thing you have to focus upon when you're working on a VR game is that you need to target your VR frame, so your game, at a 72 frames per second or higher, right? There's some games that hit 90 FPS per second, but most of the time you're going for 72 FPS or higher. If you actually go below 70 FPS, the Meta Store won't accept your game because it is that serious that you have to keep your game at that frame or higher, because otherwise you will cause a lot of nausea and you will cause a lot of motion sickness. And especially in our game in SOAR, you're flying. So imagine a game that's running at 30 FPS, like chopping, right, while you're flying. That's going to cause immediate issues, right? It's almost as if you're a nightclub and then the light show or the light system in there is basically going off and on every moment or so. And it happens a lot, right, in nightclubs, and it's fun and it's cool. But imagine if you're doing that while you're playing a fast-paced game in VR. Not fun at all. It will cause headaches and motion sicknesses. So because you have to target that, or 72 frames per second, so 72 of your game per second, and you also are working with a GPU from 2018 and CPU from 2018 to 2017, so 7 years ago, you also have to get familiar a lot with optimization techniques. And what I mean by get familiar, like you have to really be good at it. The reason for that is, obviously the case is that you have to just, at the end of the day, you have to optimize your game and you have to do that. I thought we'd have a little bit more time to be able to show basically what we can do, but the main gist is that if we talk about optimization techniques. Oh, I can't actually open Unreal anymore. I wanted to show you like the different optimization techniques. We don't have much time anymore anyway, so it doesn't matter. So texture atlasing, that's basically putting the textures, that's basically putting a lot of textures into a single big texture, and then you can use it to remap it to different models, which is very useful. Texture map mapping. So if you've ever heard of something called like 512 by 512 or power of 2 texturing, that's important to do that. So you have to basically make your textures always at a power of 2. So 256 times, another power of 2, right? or 512 or 1024 or 2048. The reason for that is because the GPU will automatically reduce the size of the textures as you go away, as you view it further away from the camera. So it's basically, if you know what level of details is, it's basically that. It's just texture mapping. Texture MIP mapping. So batch rendering in Unreal, it's called instance static meshes. Nanite obviously doesn't work on VR, let alone it works on my PC right now, right? But no, I'm kidding. Nanite works just fine. But batch rendering, just as instance static meshes, are very important in that workflow. Pooling is also very important, just making sure your memory is reusing the stuff that you've destroyed, right? And minimizing texture overhead. What I mean by that, texture overhead is in basically, the problem is that if you have a shader that has like 16 different textures in a single shader, the GPU will run out, not will run out, but will basically have something called a lot of cache misses, right? And that will be very problematic for your GPU in that sense. So you want to minimize the amount of textures inside the shader as much as possible. The thing we do in Sora is that we try to keep it at most 4 shaders per 4 textures per shader. But if we want more, we can just do a lot of texture arrays or texture atlas to get there, right? Now, choosing engines doesn't matter, kind of, and that's really the case, right? Like, you have to be careful. Not you have to be careful, but you have to just, first of all, know your preference. Unity, Unreal, Godot, right? But avoid Godot for VR. I don't think it's a good idea for VR, because VR, the problem with VR, because you're working with a lot of different SDKs, you're working with a lot of different external libraries, you have to basically stand on the shoulders of the giants, as we say. And those giants are Unity and Unreal. Godot is amazing in its own way, but in VR, Unreal and Unity is a lot more alike. And this is where it becomes more of a preference. But at the same time, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that Unity is a lot cheaper to optimize. Not cheaper, but it's a lot less work to optimize. Whereas Unreal, it's a lot more work to optimize, right? So keep that in mind. There's a review, so keep that in mind as you go further. And then one important thing I do want to mention is that you need to always test in native before assuming feature completion. Like if you're done with the feature on your Windows or Mac or Linux, whatever you use, right? But you're happy with it, it works perfectly and whatnot. Yeah, you better go ahead and compile, package, and run it on Android, because that difference of platform, that will basically, we'd have a lot of mismatches between how it used to work in editor and how it used to work in Android. And not just because it's Android, it's just because you're working with different rendering APIs. So in Unreal, you're automatically using DirectX, but in Android, you're using a Vulkan, and that changes what kind of shaders you can use, what kind of you don't have a buffer, etc. Like, gets a little bit problematic in that side. So always test in the native. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Assuming that you choose Unreal and you're happy with the choice of Unreal, and hopefully it doesn't backstab you in the next 5 years, just kind of like what Unity did, but I'm not gonna say that much about that. So say you chose with Unreal, because I've been using Unreal for such a long time, I can give you quick tips right now at the moment to just get started. So one of the things that I like doing in whether I'm starting out or whether I'm 10, 20, 30 years of experience, is that I just like using a lot of plugins that already does the job for me. Granted that we didn't develop a development kit for SOAR, a VR development kit. But what I'm advising right now is that use basically the VR template of Unreal, or use something called VRGK, which is another development kit that's made by a third party, or use something called GDXR, which is another development VR kit. They basically make things a lot easier for you to just get started, just get going. You don't have to worry too much about, oh, what if this grabbing system that I made that has this procedural animation and whatnot. If you care about creating the game, if you care about ideating your game and getting to market relatively fast, then you also care about production timeline. And production timeline, I kid you not, it is a lot longer to develop for VR than on Windows, simply because of the many different things that you have to take up. So use the tools and use the templates to do your job relatively fast. Instance tool. This is one of the, it's a godsend to me. I love it so much. I've used it a lot of. I use it basically in every VR project. But basically, this what it does, and I will link everything at the bottom of the slideshow. So there's links for everything. But basically, you use the. It's a much easier way to work with instant static meshes inside Unreal, because natively you actually don't, not natively, but vanilla Unreal doesn't actually have nice controls over the instant static meshes, whereas Instance Tool gives you that control immediately, right? So package for Android ASDC, might as well I actually run Unreal just so I can show you a bunch of things quickly. So when I say package for Android ASDC, when you package, you're gonna package for Android, package for ASDC immediately, because give you a bit of a crash course. All the other ones, so there are ECC and ASCC and all the, these are just texture compressions that work with different Android GPUs. With the MetaQuest, you're working with a Qualcomm GPU, so you're going through Android ASCC. This will reduce your package time. This will reduce your package size, and that's pretty much it. But those are very, very important keywords, right? And then one thing I use something called Qualcomm Offline Compiler. And okay, so now that Unreal is open, that's wonderful. So this is what I'm talking about, like Android, package Android. You've got a bunch of options. Go for ASCC, for Quest. And then the instance tool, as you can see, this is a third party that you can buy and then you can integrate in your project. Again, this just helps you in basically modifying the instances themselves. And what I mean by instances batching, and what I mean by batching is basically the way you tell the GPU to be like, hey, GPU, instead of rendering one mesh at a time, just render all of these meshes at the same time. So you're basically going to the kitchen once, putting all the ingredients and delivering your food and making obviously 50 meals and delivering all your food at the same time, instead of having to prepare your meal, make your meal, go deliver it, go back, make the other meal, right? So that's the analogy there, right? And so I use something called Qualcomm Offline Compiler. Again, this is getting a little bit like, I don't know if you should care to know this. It's good to know, and it's good to know like if you're very serious about VR development. But Qualcomm Offline Compiler, what it does, because you're using Qualcomm as a GPU on the Quest, you basically it's very useful if you end up going to let me get a shader, a simple shader. Okay, it's very useful for the Qualcomm offline shader, and I've linked it down below to how to install it and whatnot, to just see basically the stats of that. And what it does, that plugin, is that it just shows you basically the stats of these certain shaders. So usually when you're working for Windows, you're looking at the stats immediately right here, right? Through DirectX at some point, right? But they don't. But Unreal doesn't actually support telling you the instructions that is on the Android. So that's where the Qualcomm offline compiler. So if you hover over, you'll see like, oh, I actually have drastically different instructions versus DirectX, right? Because that's our target, and you can just inspect how much your shader is taking and you can optimize. But like if you're going for a simple game, going for a simple scope, I don't think you should worry too much about optimizing every instruction out, because your game itself is small. But in our game, for example, like I'll show you immediately, like SOAR, one of the things that we did for SOAR was that we wanted to get a 1-to-1 New York City scale. And we actually wanted to get a whole ass city inside the game. And it takes a lot of performance overhead to do that, right? So the problem with that is that we need to optimize a lot of things. We need to do a lot of things to basically bring a massive city inside SOAR. At some point, it was the largest city on the Quest, but recently there's been an update on another game that I think they have the biggest city now. But I'm happy to be at least at some point one of the biggest ones at some point. RenderDoc for profiling. Again, this is like Qualcomm offline compiler in terms of how important it is. I would recommend it as you get serious more with developing for VR, is you download something called RenderDoc. RenderDoc is basically a decompiler for the GPU. And what it does, it basically says what is the GPU is doing. So you can diagnose how many draw calls you're getting, how many triangle count you're getting, what's your texture sizes in that's being basically driven or basically being applied. Right, so it's very, very useful when it comes to breaking down the Vulkan API, because we know there's OpenGL, DirectX, Vulkan, And what the render doc does is that it breaks down these rendering APIs into actual commands to the GPU. So it's very useful in the sense of VR. So more tips on Unreal, more optimization, and this is actually like this will be useful for you because you can just copy these things and just put it into your project, and you can immediately enjoy a lot more performance than when you actually by default create an Unreal project. So one thing for sure is that you always have to keep start VR. So keep that in mind. But a bunch of the rendering settings that you can have right now is, mobile HDR is false, the anti-aliasing MSA is a 4. You can just straight up copy this and paste it into your project, and you'll immediately have performance. And then the target hardware is something that you actually will choose anyway as you create a new project. But I'll just keep in there just for reference because that's what we use in our game in Soar. And it's one of the primary settings that we have made in order to get the performance up to a optimal rendering settings in order to get the source city basic this big. One of the reasons, obviously. And by the way, not to get too technical, but you're using something called forward shading instead of deferred shading. By default, some deferred shading is enabled on all projects in Unreal. Forward shading is an alternative. What is forward shading and deferred shading? They're basically different shader pipelines on how you handle the normals, how you handle the lighting, how you handle the translucency, the post-processing, whatnot. Forward shading was actually very, very popular and very common up until up until late PlayStation 3 games or Xbox 360 games. So the 7th generation consoles, right? And then deferred shading came in. And that's why, like, for example, Crysis came in and it was like, whoa, because one of the things was like they had something called deferred shading. And deferred shading, it's basically telling the GPU, hey, GPU, store all these information about my scene so I can use this information to do a bunch of other things to make my scene look better. In forward shading, you don't have that. That's why forward shading games look a lot uglier than deferred shading games. And that's why VR games look a lot uglier than console or normal PC games. So preparing for the meta platform, kickstart you quickly on that since we're above an hour, I think, at this point. So since you're developing for the meta platform, I'm gonna help you just get quickly started on that side so you can be very comfortable with this platform. It is a very extensively well-made platform, in my opinion. They do like a little bit of support, but they do make sure they do make sure that your job is easier. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is VRCs, and VRCs is something that is not that important as you start right now, but it is important as you're developing the game and as you release close to the market. VRCs are basically guidelines or approvals of the conditions or different conditions that Meta Quest will require you to achieve in order for you to be approved into the studio. Into the store. And the earlier you do it, the better. Or as long as you're doing it throughout the production pipeline, the better. Because if you do it kind of what happened to us, it didn't exactly happen to us like that way, but kind of we kind of waited at the end, and then there was a bunch of things that we had to fix, and that delayed some production pipeline. And so my recommendation, after going through quite the hell, is you do it throughout the development cycle so that when you're ready to release, you've already have met the VRCs and Meta is already happy with your game. And obviously you have to apply for that every once in a while. So give that time to review. So another thing as well is Unreal Engine Meta Fork. So basically what this means is that Meta has created their own Unreal Engine. And it's when I say create their own, they just basically extended the current one. And what they did is that they've just optimized it a little bit just to make sure that it's a little bit even more optimized for the Quest, right? So it's not super important if you're just starting out and you just really want to dabble with the VR environment, you want to play around with the ideas that you have, but it is very important when you actually start releasing or start making a game commercially for a game, because this will save you even further performance in order for the future. Again, the links for this stuff is at the bottom. which I guess we can share the slideshow later or whatever, or I can put screenshots or DM me. I don't know. We'll see. So one thing as well is release channels. So release channels are super, super important, especially if you're a small team. If you're a solo developer, not a big problem. But if you're a team, release channels are very useful because what you can do is that, well, first of all, let me define release channels. Release channels are basically this. Imagine the app on your phone, right? Just like any other app on the phone. And that's what we have on the MetaQuest. You literally have dashboard and then an app, which is the game. But then instead of basically having different versions for different apps, you can actually modify the version that you want on the app itself inside the MetaQuest, for example, right? And this is where, and that's what release channels do. And so you can define like, oh, now I want to play the beta version of this game. Now I want to play the early access version of this. Now I want to play the live version of this, right? So what this is useful for, and again, there's a link for this, is that this helps you a lot to just like basically ship out builds very rapidly to different people and have them tested without having to destructively delete, your current release or your current version, right? So you can have debug version, you can have a bunch of different versions. It's very, very useful when you start out and you aim for the MetaQuest store. Make sure to keep that in mind. Okay, so one key highlight as well, just always give time for review, enough time for review, just like Steam. I would give Steam a few days until they approve my Steam assets on my game store or whatever. Same thing with Meta. They're a little bit as well slower. Maybe they're not. I don't know. But my experience is that it was a little bit slower. So make sure to give time for review. Now, plugins, MetaXR is OpenXR. So you hear a lot of words about MetaXR, OpenXR, XR this, XR that. Like, like there's so much XRs. Like there's no technical standard, right? So what I recommend doing from now on is basically just basically have MetaXR enabled, just like what we have right now. I don't think we actually have. I need to verify. So OpenXR have it enabled for sure. And then MetaXR, you also need to have it, not XR platform. XR, I guess it's an engine plugin, so it doesn't show up here, but MetaXR. Oh, it's not I'm using Unreal 4.27, and it's not called MetaXR back then because this version is 4 years old. It's called Oculus XR or something. There's no reason why I'm using 4.27 instead of 5, and it's for performance. So anyway. So Oculus VR. So basically, what I recommend is just basically have those two plugins and not worry about all the different XR XR SDKs of all the others, right? Especially if you're just doing it for MetaXR. And one last thing for the Meta platform, MetaQuest Developer Hub and MetaLink. Those are very two important things that I really think that you should. I mean, one of them you should have because you can't run your VR headset on the editor if you don't have it open. So this is one of them. This is the Meta link. You should definitely have that. Then there's something called that's optional called MetaXR platform. MetaQuest Developer Hub, not a MetaXR platform. A MetaQuest Developer Hub is basically a developer hub. It's very useful. It has profiling. It has like version checking. It has like downloads to download different SDKs and whatnot. App distribution, file manager is very, very useful. And I highly recommend if you get serious about this to download that. One last thing about production. Are we almost done? I think we are almost done. Okay. I hope it's been useful so far. So one last thing, production. So this is more from my personal point of view, and this is my opinion, obviously, to how to handle production and how to handle studio direction for VR studios, and especially in the VR market. Having been, for example, having my own studio like 6 years back, and now being part of many different studios at the current age. So the first thing is that I would say speed is so important that like genuinely, obviously, such a given, like speed is important. Yeah, right. Like it's such a given, but speed to actually get release something is so important in VR because like we said just earlier, as long as it's not janky, as long as it plays well, as long as your game is good, don't worry too much about polish. Don't worry too much about having the best art style and having the best rendering technique or having the best this or that, right? Like just get to the market, just get it out there, right? Your quality of life is important too, because you're dealing with, again, headaches. You're dealing with nausea, especially if you're making a very weirdly intense locomotion game. One thing I like doing, and I recommend a lot to a lot of developers, is I have a mannequin head, right, that has a headset on. And the one thing I do a lot is basically I just hold it and I just use my controller on top of it in order to basically simulate that I am wearing the headset, but I'm not. I'm tricking it. So I'm bamboozling the the Meta platform that there's someone else playing it, just because I like my eyes and I get tired very quickly sometimes. So that's why your quality of life is important. So invest in these things. If you get serious about this, invest in these things. It's important that you stay, just like you take care of the player's well-being in the game, you take care of your own well-being as well throughout development in VR, and of course in any other VR, in any other development environment, VR or not. So test the market fast. That's so basically what I'm saying to the first point. Get your idea fast, get it done, test it, right? Sideload it. If you don't want to put it on the if you don't want to put it on the Meta platform because you've got like a bunch of problems with the VRCs or whatever, or with reviewing, there's something called SideQuest, and SideQuest is much more lenient about putting your games on VR. So I should have written that, but anyway, just take a note, SideQuest. And then this is where you can like really rapidly test your game out and see what people think about it. It's basically perfect. I have a perfect analogy, by the way. I just came up with it. Oh my God. I have more than one brain cell. It's basically HIO versus Steam. That's what it is. So SideQuest for that. And one thing after release as well, let's say you're a live game, which is what SOAR is right now at the moment, is that you need to feed the algorithm. And you feed the algorithm by doing one thing for sure, is by constantly updating the game. It is a lot easier for you to, it's a lot better for you to at the end of the day to get the game done and then just constantly update it on top to feed the algorithm. As long as you're happy with it, I'm not saying just release a cube out there, right? But basically that, like just keep on feeding the algorithm, post live service release, post whatever. Even if you just have 5 users, whatever, right? Just keep the algorithm gods happy because they will make you happy if you make them happy. That's literally the survival motto of VR studios and any other studio out there. Just keep the algorithm happy. And then one of the most important things, or the final thing, is that keep your scope small and tight. Don't go overboard. Don't go too much. Gorilla Tag was made by one guy. As a reminder, Gorilla Tag was made by one guy 4 years ago, and he only focused on 3 main primary things: being a gorilla, having the locomotion of gorilla, and tagging. And of course, the nice PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 graphics, or the pixelated-esque graphics, right? It could be any console of that era. It doesn't have to be PlayStation 1, please. But he kept it small and he kept it quick and he pushed it out there. So your goal is to probably do something similar. Don't spend too much time, 2 or 3 years, especially if you're starting out on the game that you're working in VR, because the VR landscape is constantly shifting. So by the time you start the game and by the time you finish it, could be that the landscape isn't the same anymore, and you're caught in a trap, right? One things that I would like to do in the future, and that's not what we did with SOAR, for example, is that we didn't keep the development timeline fast, but we still released a early access like a year and a half ago, and we just kept updating it. So that's pretty much it on my end. If you guys want more technicals and more whatnot, and just any advice that you want as well, or any feedback you want as well on VR and whatnot, and specifically as well, technically and engineering side of things, please ping me on my socials. I'm Lee Hammoud, basically everywhere on Discord, Blue Sky, X.com, even Facebook, hell, whatever. So yeah, and good luck and have fun and enjoy. And remember that this is a very long process. It takes a lot of patience to develop, and takes, and like they always say, like 10,000 hours to master something, right? So this is my first game in 2015, for example, that came out 10 years ago at this point, and it was trash. It was absolute trash. But um, it came out, and ever since it's been hopefully improving. So yeah, just keep in mind that you will constantly improve as long as you do. And yeah, just good luck, especially in the current time where the industry is in a turmoil. Luck is very much needed. Yeah. Anyway. Oh, references. These are links. Have fun with them. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Lee. Ashraf had to step out, so I'm here.
Hi, Anna. Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
how are you?
I am fine. What about you?
Thank you. I'm good. It was a great session. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
So we'll just wait a few seconds in case anyone wants to ask you a question. And meanwhile, I have a question. Do you have any
Yes.
advice to our participants doing their first game?
Yes. So to basically, I'll say this over and over and over again because would like to keep doing that myself as well. Keep it simple, keep it tight, keep your scope just very focused and hangs on a few hooks or one or two hooks and focus on that. In the future, you can constantly update and you can constantly layer it on top of each other, but just get something small and something very tight and quick out there. Not quick, but take your time if you want, but just keep it small is what I'm saying. Um, yeah, for now. And obviously, the first one will not be your best. It will be your worst game. The first game will be your worst. The second game will be better. The third will be a little bit better, and the fourth will be even better. So the idea is that one thing I've noticed with a lot of the developers, with their big studios or, well, not big studios, but like indie studios and or one developer, is that they always had a focus on just like what their strength is, and they just build on top of that over the years. For example, Lethal Company, the guy who made Lethal Company, he built on top of the year, like it was his like 10th game, right? But he had like 9 games on HI already. But those 9 games had a shared sort of style to the 10th game, which is Lethal Company, right? And it had this sort of very pixelated, not pixelated, but 3D pixelated, quite not horror-y, but also like mysterious kind of look. And you can see that in all of his game. So know your strengths, keep it small, and develop your style.
Thank you so much. That's such a great answer to focus on something small at the beginning and to develop your strength as you move forward. It seems that we
Yes.
don't have any questions, so we'll end it here. Thank you again, Lee, and thank you everyone for joining, and we'll
Thank
see
you.
you soon. Bye bye.
Thanks, y'all. Goodbye.